Imagine spending billions on a giant water project that is meant to drought-proof inland Australia, only to discover that the reservoir at the heart of it might never properly fill. Not because the engineers forgot how dams work, and not because the country lacked ambition, but because the heat, the distance, and the numbers were never really on its side. That is the hook at the center of the Bradfield Scheme, one of the boldest and strangest ideas in Australian history. And what makes it even more gripping is this: it did not come from a crank. It came from John Bradfield, the engineer best known for the Sydney Harbour Bridge. So when he said Australia could take water from the wet north and send it inland to the dry heart of the continent, people did not laugh him out of the room. They leaned in. And honestly, you can see why. Australia has always had a messy relationship with water. Up north, rivers can roar through the wet season and dump huge volumes out to sea. Further inland, graziers and farmers can be hanging on by their fingernails, watching paddocks crack open and waiting for rain that does not come. One part of the country is flooded, another part is bone dry, and the whole thing can feel like a bad joke told by geography. So the Bradfield Scheme landed right on a national nerve. It offered a simple promise for a very hard problem. Stop letting all that fresh water run away in the north, move it inland, grow more food, build up the regions, and make the country a bit less at the mercy of drought. Say it quickly and it sounds like common sense. That is part of why the scheme has survived for so long. It sounds practical. It sounds tough-minded. It sounds like the sort of thing Australians used to do before consultants, reviews, and budget papers got in the way. But once you slow down and look properly, the story changes. The Bradfield Scheme is not really the story of a great project that timid people refused to build. It is the story of a great national dream that kept running into the same cold facts. To understand why it had such pull in the first place, you have to start with Bradfield himself. This was not some bloke waving a map around in the pub. John Bradfield was one of the country's most respected engineers. He had proper runs on the board. The Sydney Harbour Bridge alone gave his name enormous weight. And that matters because people will forgive a lot from a dreamer if he has already built something unforgettable. In 1938, Bradfield laid out his plan to divert water from North Queensland inland. In broad terms, he wanted to capture water from the upper Tully, Herbert, and Burdekin catchments, store it, move it west across the Great Dividing Range, and then send it into inland river systems where it could support irrigation. A catchment, by the way, is simply the area of land where rainfall drains into the same river system. Irrigation just means supplying water to farms when rainfall is not enough. The basic pitch was not hard to follow. Take water from the wet side of the range and send it to the dry side. In later versions of the plan, that water would move through the Flinders and Thompson systems and, in the Big Dream version, help transform inland country leading toward the Lake Eyre Basin. The center of the original scheme was a big dam at Hell's Gates on the upper Burdekin. In Bradfield's 1938 plan, that dam was around 122 meters high, with a tunnel of roughly 144 kilometers carrying water west through the range. That alone should tell you how ambitious this was. A 144-kilometer tunnel is not a side project. It is the sort of thing that makes ordinary public works look like a weekend job. Bradfield later came back with an even bigger 1942 version, pushing the Hell's Gates proposal to around 152 meters and imagining huge volumes being sent inland year after year. And here is where the dream becomes very Australian. Because on paper,
it is hard not to feel the pull of it. Northern Queensland gets smashed with rain. Inland Australia is dry. Move the water. Solve the problem. There is a rough and ready logic to that which appeals to the national temperament. We like big fixes. We like practical heroics. We like the idea that if something is broken, the answer is not to whinge about it, but to build something enormous and get on with the job. The trouble is, paper is forgiving. Landscapes are not.
The first major problem with the Bradfield scheme was water itself. Bradfield believed there was much more water available for diversion than modern science suggests is realistic. He estimated annual flows from the Upper Tully, Herbert, Burdekin and Flinders systems at about 7,190 gigalitres a year. Modern assessments put the figure closer to 3,305 gigalitres. That is not a rounding error. That is the difference between planning around a full bucket and then discovering you are working with something a lot less generous. One modern comparison on the Burdekin alone is just as brutal. Bradfield estimated about 3,678 gigalitres, while modern analysis comes in closer to 1,665. If those numbers are off, everything downstream starts wobbling. The dam size changes, the transfer volumes change, the farming promises change, the economics change. It is the kind of mistake that does not just weaken a project, it changes what the project actually is. And that brings us to the next problem: distance. Australians have a funny relationship with distance. We talk about places being just a few hours away, as though that is barely worth mentioning. But moving water is not like driving to Dubbo. Every kilometre costs money. Every bit of channel, tunnel, storage, lining, maintenance and access infrastructure costs money. And the Bradfield scheme was never about shifting water around the corner. It was about moving it across mountain country, through remote terrain, and then over vast inland distances. Later, Bradfield-style concepts looked at channels stretching hundreds of kilometers, even more than 1,600 kilometers in some modern transfer concepts toward existing farming regions. At that point, you were not just building water infrastructure, you were trying to bend a continent into a shape that suits your spreadsheet. Then there is the question of elevation. Bradfield hoped much of the system could work by gravity, which is always the dream because gravity is free. If the land falls the right way, water moves without expensive pumping. But gravity only helps if the country actually sits where you think it does. Bradfield was working in the 1930s and 40s. He did not have the kind of detailed digital mapping and hydrological modeling that later experts had. Hydrology, if that word sounds too technical, just means the science of how water moves through rivers, soil, landscapes, and climate. Once modern analysts checked the terrain properly, it became clear that parts of the scheme were far more difficult and far more expensive than the original vision suggested. Now we get to the problem that really puts a knife through the romance: evaporation. Australia is hot. Inland Australia can be savagely hot. If you build a giant open reservoir or long open channels in that kind of climate, you lose water straight back into the air. That is evaporation, and in this story, it is not a minor issue tucked away in the fine print. It is one of the central reasons the scheme came unstuck. In fact, one of the most striking findings in later reviews was that under one of Bradfield's larger historic concepts, average net evaporation from the reservoir could exceed average inflow. Put simply, the dam could sit there under the sun, losing water faster than it reliably gained it. Imagine selling the country a giant inland water fix and then finding the main storage behaves like a very expensive hot pan left out in the weather. That is the detail that really changes the tone of the story. Suddenly, this is not just a bold plan facing a few hurdles. It is a plan colliding with basic physical reality. The land is too big, the water is less abundant than hoped, the losses are worse than expected, the heat is ruthless, and no amount of patriotic language fixes that. Still, the scheme never quite dies. Every time a bad drought rolls through, Bradfield comes back. The pitch is always familiar. Australia used to think big. Australia used to build things. Australia should stop wasting water into the sea. The north is wet, the inland is dry, and somewhere in that gap sits the old fantasy that one heroic national project could finally sort the whole mess out. It is emotionally powerful because it flatters something deep in the Australian character. We do like the idea that one gutsy practical answer can fix a complicated problem. But courage is not the same thing as viability. That distinction matters because once the Bradfield scheme became symbolic, people stopped judging it like a project and started judging it like a test of national character. Support it, and you are a builder. Question it, and you must be timid, bureaucratic, scared of ambition. It is a clever way to dodge the numbers, except the numbers do not go away just because the speech sounds good. When modern reviews were carried out, especially by CSIRO and later by the Queensland government's expert panel, the verdict was fairly blunt. Large-scale Bradfield-style diversion was not considered economically viable, and it raised serious environmental, social, and cultural concerns as well. That is a harder judgment than simply saying it is difficult. It means that even if engineering could force parts of it into existence, it still would not be a sensible answer to the problem it claimed to solve. The economics were grim. Take one later-style concept that looked at getting water toward existing farming country in the northern Murray-Darling Basin. The infrastructure cost just to deliver water as far as St. George was estimated at around 16 to 32 billion Australian dollars, with annual operating costs in the order of 140 to 280 million. And that is before you start pretending every downstream farming forecast will work perfectly. Even under optimistic assumptions, the expected agricultural returns covered only a fraction of the cost. That is not a project that merely looks pricey. That is a project that starts making the whole idea of commercial sense look faintly embarrassed. And there is another thing worth saying here. Water on its own does not create prosperity by magic. It helps, obviously, but you also need suitable soils, roads, storage, power, labor, markets, and a proper business case. Sending water inland does not automatically turn dry country into a food bowl. Sometimes it just means you have spent a fortune delivering a scarce resource to a place where it produces less value than if it had been used closer to where it originally fell. That is one of the reasons modern policy thinking shifted away from giant, heroic transfer schemes and toward using water closer to where it falls, backed by smaller regional grids and more local development. That approach is less romantic, I know. Nobody gets misty-eyed about sensible regional water planning. It does not have the same mythic pull as redirecting rivers and making the desert bloom, but it stacks up better. And in the end, that is the whole point. Water policy is not there to make us feel bold. It is there to work. Then there's the part of the story that big infrastructure romantics tend to rush past: environmental and cultural impact. Moving water on this scale changes river systems. It affects wetlands, habitats, flood patterns, water quality, and species that depend on natural flow cycles. It can also affect communities and First Nations groups whose connection to those river systems is not some box to tick after the concrete goes in. Modern assessments weighed those issues too, and they mattered. This was never just a question of whether Australians still had the nerve to dream big. It was also a question of what damage we were prepared to excuse in the name of progress. To be fair, not every modern finding was entirely negative. Some modeling suggested certain configurations might reduce some flood impacts in parts of the north. And there were also discussions about possible water quality benefits in some catchments. But those upsides were not strong enough to save the broader case. They were side benefits, not the main event. The bigger picture stayed the same: too costly, too lossy, too disruptive, and too weak in return for the scale of what had to be built. So why does Bradfield still have such grip on the public imagination? Because it offers a clean answer to a dirty problem. Australia's water story is patchy, political, seasonal, and regional. It is not one neat problem with one neat fix. The Bradfield scheme cuts through all that with a promise simple enough to fit on the back of an envelope. Take water from the wet bit and move it to the dry bit. Job done. It sounds like common sense, even when the science says otherwise. And when towns are under water restrictions, when crops are failing, when people are exhausted by another dry year, neat answers can sound a lot better than careful ones. Maybe that is the real lesson here. The Bradfield Scheme was never just about engineering. It was about faith. Faith that a difficult continent could be corrected by a sufficiently large act of will. Faith that fresh water reaching the sea must somehow be wasted water. Faith that if inland Australia remained harsh, the real problem must be human hesitation rather than the basic nature of the place. It is a tempting story, especially in a country that likes doers and distrusts hand-wringing. But the facts kept refusing to play along. That is why the Bradfield Scheme still matters. Not because Australia missed out on some guaranteed masterpiece, but because it reveals something about us. Our love of big fixes, our impatience with limits, our habit of turning practical arguments into moral ones. John Bradfield was a brilliant engineer, and the scheme that carries his name was one of the boldest visions ever proposed for inland Australia. But boldness is not enough. It does not make rivers flow harder. It does not cool the sun over a reservoir, and it does not rescue a project when the water, the terrain, and the economics all start pulling the same way.